It's no secret that I'm a PC nerd. I mean, I'm literally surrounded by PC hardware, and my entire YouTube channel is based on showing you how to build computers, how they perform, and all the different parts in them, all that sort of stuff. And so, for me having one of these, well, it's a little strange. Now, to make it clear, I am not an Apple fanboy. I'm probably the direct opposite. I do not own any Apple products, and the Apple ecosystem is not something that I subscribe to. Now, this video is obviously going to be different from the usual M1 Mac review, and if you're not interested in hearing what is effectively a semi-irrelevant opinion, then feel free to go and watch the thousands of other videos that are out on the internet talking about this thing in a, I guess, more favourable or more useful light. But I am definitely intrigued by this thing. Not because it's the Mac Mini, but the M1 chip in particular. This is incredibly unique and something that I can see being a trend across the rest of the PC industry as well. Now, you've probably already seen this thing 1,000 ways from Sunday, but allow me to briefly recap. This is an Apple Mac Mini. It is essentially a small desktop computer with relatively limited I/O and formerly used Intel CPUs. You can still buy the Intel CPU versions for now, but if you're planning on sort of future-proofing your Apple ecosystem life, then you'll probably want to pick up this model instead. This is using Apple's own CPU. It's called the M1 and it's based on Apple Silicon, which is essentially, with some convoluted steps in between, a modified iPad CPU running a desktop operating system. This chip was heralded as offering the world's fastest CPU in low-power silicon and a breakthrough for portable computing. It's an 8-core chip that offers desktop-stomping performance with ultra-thin, ultra-light laptop levels of power draw. The M1 chip itself is what piqued my interest. Not the fact that it's in a Mac Mini, because the fact that it's in a Mac Mini is actually slightly worse than having it in a laptop, since the Mac Mini version, despite having a relatively large heatsink, a whole load of basically wasted space inside this box, and a fan, this one doesn't seem to run any faster than the MacBook Air or Pro 13 variants instead. No, what's interesting is that Apple have got an ARM CPU running a desktop operating system and desktop programs, and well. See, I've used Microsoft Surface Pro X, which is essentially the same thing. It's an ARM-based, essentially mobile CPU running a desktop operating system. And honestly, it was pretty hopeless. The operating system couldn't run a lot of the applications you would like to use, and even with future revisions, as I've heard, it is a little bit better, but generally speaking, it was a very limiting experience. But Apple, well, being Apple, they seem to have done it pretty well. Let's take a step back and explain what makes the M1 such a unique and interesting chip, and starting with explaining what ARM is. ARM is a British company that designs CPU cores and processors and then licenses those designs to people like Samsung and Qualcomm, and more importantly for this story, Apple. Apple then go and modify those chips those designs pretty heavily, and then manufacture them as their own processors. They've been doing that for a long time on the desktop, or the mobile side of things, from your iPhones and iPads, but they're now moving that onto the desktop realm. The reason that that's interesting is that ARM CPUs use an entirely different style of computing and a different instruction set. They use RISC, or Reduced Instruction Set Computing, which is a much more efficient and direct way of communicating with a processor and telling it what to do. See, your desktop processor from Intel or AMD uses the x86 and AMD 64 instruction sets. Those are essentially a bit more abstract. You can tell one of those processors to just add 2 numbers or 2 values stored in memory, and it will go away and find the numbers that it needs, bring them back and load them, add them together, and then store them again without you having to tell it anything more than just add. Whereas on a RISC processor, you need to tell it exactly what you want it to do. If you want to add 2 numbers, then you have to tell it to go load those 2 bits of memory, then you can add them together, and then you can store them back again. That style or that difference means that with a RISC processor, you can very heavily optimize those exact instructions versus on the x86 side of things, it's a lot more difficult to optimize for what can be more abstract and vague tasks. The reason all of that is important sort of background knowledge is to understand that RISC and x86 aren't directly compatible. You can't just run a standard version of Windows or macOS on an ARM-based CPU and expect it to boot up and run just fine. You would need to have a custom version of the operating system or a very good and very fast translator to translate those x86 instructions into RISC instructions that can then run on that processor. The thing is, if anyone was going to do this right, it would be Apple, thanks to their sort of closed walled garden ecosystem, and well, they seem to have done it. They have created an ARM-based version of their macOS operating system based on their Big Sur version, but more importantly, they've also created a translator. It's called Rosetta 2, and it's incredible. Now, Microsoft have done a very similar thing. They have created an x86 emulator, but in my experience, it basically didn't work. When you could make it run an x86 app, sometimes it would be okay, but more often than not it would crash, and more often than that you just couldn't run a lot of programs. Whereas on the M1 Max, a lot of the time I didn't know I was running the Intel version, as it says in Activity Monitor, of an app until I checked an Activity Monitor. Now, in my benchmark results, it seems like the Rosetta 2 performance hit can be anywhere between 30 and 50%. That is a very wide estimate for sure, but the fact that I can edit videos in Premiere using Rosetta or edit videos in the beta version of Premiere using Apple's own design and using the RISC instruction set version instead, and the fact that the experience was pretty much identical except for when it came to render times, that's fantastic. But if you have to take a performance hit to use some of the non-updated applications, then why bother using an ARM chip anyway? Well, the answer is this. This is me running Blender and measuring the total system power drop. That is the plug that comes out of the back of it, how many electrons are flowing through that wire into this Mac to run a 4K display and to be rendering in Blender. Can you see the number? Yeah, it's 30 watts. Compare that to a desktop Ryzen CPU, say a 3600X, which isn't the fastest, but does have relatively similar performance in single and multi-threaded workloads, and yeah, that draws 86 watts just from the package. An entire system running that 4K display would draw around 100 or so watts from the wall when doing that sort of task, which is absolutely insane. And bear in mind that when measuring the power draw from the Mac, I'm measuring total system power draw, which includes power supply losses, it includes any peripherals that I have connected, it includes the power that the graphics core is using to draw that display, and so the actual CPU itself doing that render is likely only drawing between 10 and 15 watts at most. And then there's the performance. I'm going to throw up a graph of the M1 running Cinebench R23 natively, so not using Rosetta 2, and I'll compare it to a desktop 6-core Ryzen chip, the 3600X. Now, do you notice anything? Yeah, in the single-threader results, the laptop CPU that is the M1 beats the desktop Ryzen chip by 15%. I should make it clear that the M1 is also only drawing about 10 watts from the wall when running the single-threaded test, whereas a Ryzen chip would be drawing more like 50 or 60. The other thing is that if you then swap to the multi-thread results, the result inverts, and the Ryzen chip beats the M1 by around about 17%. Now, the M1 should be an 8-core, so why is it not absolutely demolishing a 6-core desktop chip when it can demolish it in the single-threaded results? Well, if I now throw up a comparison to the 3300X, which is a quad-core Ryzen chip, well, that starts to make more sense. The M1 is faster in both single and multi-threaded by about 15% on both, and there's a good reason for that. The discrepancy comes from what is essentially one of the great features of using an ARM-based design. See, ARM offers a thing called Big Little, which lets you pair high power, high performance cores with lower power, low performance cores, for which the lower power cores will take care of all the background tasks, running the operating system, using a web browser, whatever else. But then when you want to do something intensive, the high power cores spring into action and you're using them instead. But when you're not using them, they turn off to save battery. That's why the M1 Macs, especially in the laptop configurations, can offer better battery life than anything Intel has to offer right now. Apple's using 4 high-performance cores and 4 efficiency cores in the M1, which means that you essentially have a quad-core CPU that has 4 extra cores to do little background things while you're doing something intensive. From my testing, the low power cores account for anywhere between 1 and 1.5 high power cores worth of performance, which gives you a good idea of the ratio of how effectively slow but efficient those lower power cores are versus the higher power ones. In the real world, this thing is plenty fast enough for any level of sort of basic task, web browsing, word processing, watching 4K videos, whatever. But it's also incredibly impressive for editing videos in Final Cut, for example, or even in Premiere, which is a lot less of an optimized experience. I must admit, using Final Cut, even though the UI is something that I'm not used to, not familiar with, and I don't like how some of the things operate, the smoothness and the fact that the second I imported the footage, I could scrub around 4K clips with absolutely no problems, is something I definitely could get used to compared to Premiere, where you have to wait ages for things to import properly, and you generally still can't scrub around things even on ultra fast storage. And so yeah, there's definitely something to be said about that sort of it just works experience. Power users like me should probably stay away from the M1 chips for now. The M1 is great for the standard applications that it's in, especially on the laptop side. It can do pretty much anything any of the Intel ones can do, if not better, but for the sort of power user who would normally buy a MacBook 16-inch, well, there's a reason why Apple hasn't put the M1 in the 16-inch version yet. There's still a lot of teething issues to get by. Don't get me wrong, this is way more seamless to use than anything that Microsoft has offered thus far, but I did have a couple of issues. Namely, when using the M1 Mac Mini, the screen started flickering, so much so that my friend, who is a lot more of an Apple nerd than I am, had to basically turn away and stop looking at the display for significant periods of time while we were running benchmarks and tests. And we tried updating the operating system to hopefully get rid of those issues, at which point this happened. This was a very weird thing. It stayed on until I held down the power button to turn the machine off, and then when we turn it back on, all was well again. There wasn't any problems, but when I looked online, the flickering issue does seem to be prevalent in both the Mac Minis and even in the new MacBooks, so keep that in mind. And when running apps through Rosetta, you might see a bit of instability or features that were specifically designed around x86 instructions that aren't easily translatable to ARM or to RISC. Those features might just flat out not work. And so it's definitely an early adopter tax type experience. You will be paying that early adopter tax. It's definitely a first generation device, but it's a lot more impressive than I thought it would be. For me, as a PC nerd, this is definitely interesting, but I wouldn't ever buy one. I don't need a laptop CPU, and even though the performance per watt is undeniably impressive, even when they bring out the 16 and 32 and 64 core variants, which I'm definitely excited to see, it's not for me. I have an extreme dislike for Apple's walled garden, closed off ecosystem, and I would much rather have a slightly slower but more under my control and actually feel like I own the thing than having a bit more performance and feel like I don't. If I wanted a laptop, then I would much prefer a higher power gaming machine with dedicated graphics that I can game and edit on the go, and that pretty much rules out any Apple device, even the MacBook Pro 16-inch, and so it's definitely not my, I suppose, my kettle of fish, but at the same time, it's undeniably interesting and impressive, and I can see the technology of using ARM CPUs in a more widespread form factor. I think for the time being, it will still remain a more mobile-centered, efficiency-based type of objective rather than raw performance, but I wouldn't be overly surprised if in 10, 15, 20 years, desktop CPUs from the likes of AMD and Intel do actually offer ARM variants, and especially on the Windows side of things, there will be a more reasonable x86 emulator, and the usage experience for an ARM CPU on Windows might actually be usable. But for the time being, this is an interesting thing to take a look at, but it's not for me. With that said, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of Apple's M1? Is this something you'd pick up yourself? And also, what do you think of it being in a Mac Mini that's no faster than any of the other laptop counterparts, despite all of the size and heatsink and fan that's in there? I would definitely love to hear your thoughts on all of that in the comments down below. Of course, you can pick one of these up, and I'll leave a link to Apple in the comments down below. And also, I want to give a massive thank you to Chris, who sent this over for me to take a look at, as well as his Threadripper system. If you want to check out that one, feel free to check that out in the cards or on the end cards as well. Otherwise, that is pretty much it for me. If you want to support these videos and keep making them every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, then of course you can hit the subscribe button, and you can check out the rest of the links in the description down below, from merch or hoodies or t-shirts like this one, or a load of other cool designs. There's also affiliate links to places like Amazon and Overclock UK if you're buying from there, and a load of other stuff. There's Patreon for access to our Money Min Discord chat and sponsor-free videos, and a load of stuff, so feel free to check it out. Like I said, there's more videos on the end cards if you want to keep watching, and that's pretty much it from me. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments down below, but otherwise, we'll see you on the next video.